It's that classic Christian Dior scent. It was actually Christian Dior's labor of love. He commissioned it in 1955. And if you've ever smelled it, you know that the main scent of Diorissimo is the lily of the valley. Christian Dior chose that scent because the lily of the valley was what he called his fortune flower. And whenever he smelled it, it smelled to him like pleasure and hope. Marie-Joseph, a French lady, she loved the scent of Diorissimo. She wore it every day, every single day. So much so that her preteen son smelled it every day, and to him it became part of her identity. It was to him who she was. In fact, Marie-Joseph was fascinated by all things Dior. She was fascinated by their elegance and their stately charm. And so her son heard about Christian Dior so much that for his entire life, Dior would occupy a part of his brain, a part of his subconscious, and it stayed there through his whole life. Her son graduated from one of the top French engineering schools and then went to work for his father at his father's construction company. Over the years, the son convinced his father to move away from construction and to move into real estate, and it turned out to be a prudently profitable decision for them. Their business exploded, and eventually the son moved from France to New York City, where his business continued to grow, all the while keeping an eye on the business climate back in France. Well, in 1984, the once celebrated French textile company Boussac was facing bankruptcy. They were bleeding money. They were losing money every single day. And the French government was so proud of this company that they were desperately trying to save it. And so as the son one day actually received an offer, he looked through the portfolio of Boussac and he saw that in addition to the textiles manufacturing, they owned a lot of retail and other manufacturing companies. And so as he scanned through the list, he saw one company, and right there he decided that he had to buy Boussac. And so he found a way and he did it. And very systematically, he took each one of those separate companies and he sold them off until there was only one left, the crown jewel of the Boussac company, Christian Dior. And so now the son owned the company that his mother cherished so much. And using that acquisition as the foundation, the son went on to build the world's largest luxury brand conglomerate, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. And the son became one of the richest men in the world, Bernard Arnault, chairman and CEO of LVMH. Think about the words that you whisper to your children. Think about the words. When my mom was growing up, she wanted to be an attorney. It was her dream to go to law school and become an attorney. But her father, who was a very devout Christian, told her that you can't be an attorney because all lawyers are liars. Now, I don't think that's true, but that's what he thought. And so he wouldn't let her go to law school. And so she ended up going to engineering school. Well, my brother, all his life, wanted to be a doctor. His entire life. And somehow, when he got to college, everything changed, and he ended up going to law school, and he became a lawyer. And now he has an immigration practice down in Southern California. I, on the other hand, grew up always wanting to be a lawyer. I mean, I remember back in the 8th grade, a friend of mine, we both decided we were going to be lawyers. We even wrote out our letterhead, and we actually tried to find some of our classmates so that we could represent them. I mean, it was just what I wanted to do my entire life. I couldn't wait. I got through 2 years, and life happened, and I got married and had kids, and all of a sudden there was just no time to finish school. Over the years, I tried to actually finish, jump back in 3 different times. The last time about 7 years ago, almost 30 years after I first started school. But as soon as I started back into law school, something happened and I ended up going to seminary instead. And the funny thing is that just after I started law school this last time, my daughter entered law school. And she graduated and now she is an attorney. There's this interesting influencing factor that in children that psychologists describe as parents' unfulfilled dreams. That studies show that the unfulfilled dreams of the parents are somehow passed on to our children. It affects how we parent our children and how our children respond to our parenting. Think about the words that you whisper. Today we are in episode 3 of our series, Nemesis, Villains of the Bible, and we've been talking about the villains of the Bible. We've been talking about the things that influence them, the things that happened in their lives, and really is a cautionary tale to make sure that we see those same signs ahead of us and make different decisions so that we end up in a different place. Today we're going to talk about someone that if I told you this person's name right now, you would probably go, huh? Who's that? I mean, even if you are a person who grew up reading the Bible, grew up going to church, this is a name that you may not recall, that you may never have heard before. But before we get into our villain for today, I want to give you a little bit of historical context so that you know the setting for what's happening in today's account of our villain for the day. In ancient Israel, the height of the kingdom of Israel was under the reign of King David. And that was about 1000 to 960 BC. That was the height of the kingdom of Israel. When David passed on, his son Solomon became king. And Solomon ruled the kingdom of Israel from about 960 to about 920 BC. After King Solomon, however, the kingdom split into 2. The northern half of the kingdom kept the name the Kingdom of Israel, while the southern half of the kingdom, which included the city of Jerusalem, was called the Kingdom of Judah. And it was in the Kingdom of Judah that the hereditary line of King David remained. Now, all of the kings of Israel were unfaithful to or they rejected God. In the south, some were the same, but some were not. It went back and forth. So now we fast forward to about 850 BC. So about 100 years later, after the end of King Solomon's reign. King Ahab is now the king of Israel. And he ends up marrying the daughter of the king of Tyre. Tyre is a small kingdom that's right up against the Mediterranean Sea. And he marries the king of Tyre's daughter, a woman named Jezebel. Now Jezebel, who was not a follower of God, convinces Ahab to compromise his beliefs. You see, Jezebel grew up in a kingdom and in a family that worshipped Baal as their god. And so when Jezebel married Ahab, she started to convince him, and he started to agree that it was okay to worship God and Baal. And then it became to worship God with Baal, until eventually she was able to convince him to stop worshiping God altogether and instead just worship Baal. And King Ahab and the kingdom of Israel eventually abandoned God altogether. One day Ahab is in battle with the king of Judah, and he dies in the battle. And his son Ahaziah takes the throne of Israel. Now, at that same time, down in the kingdom of Judah, Jehoshaphat is the king. Now, his father, the king before him, was Asa, and Asa was a good king. He was a good king. Scripture tells us that Asa was a king who followed God's commands. And Jehoshaphat, Scripture tells us, walked in the ways of his ancestor David. So Jehoshaphat was also a good king. But Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram, was not. He was a wicked king. So this was an interesting time in the history of both Israel and Judah. In that time, worshiping God was not illegal, but it wasn't popular. It was seen as opposed to the national religion. It was seen as anti-cultural or countercultural. Baal worship had infiltrated every aspect of society in the kingdom, and Baal worship placed the happiness, the satisfaction, the acceptance of the individual over everything else. It was a time when all sexual norms were completely discarded. Sex with anyone, sex with anything was available everywhere. In fact, temple worship in that time involved and included sexual acts. And what happens, though we have seen in history in every culture where sex is reduced to simply an act, there comes the problem of unwanted pregnancies. And these children that were being results of these unwanted pregnancies were very inconvenient to the people. And so they had to find a way to get rid of them. And so part of Baal worship began to include child sacrifice. They would sacrifice these children to Baal, to the lesser gods that were all controlled by Baal. And it's interesting because, evil practices, they never really go away. They just evolve. As the Canaanite religion, as the worship of Baal started to wane, Baal evolved into the Roman god Zeus. When the Roman influence started to slow down, then Zeus evolved into the Greek god Jupiter. Unfortunately, this ideology still influences both religious and non-religious practices today. It's just known by different names. Which brings us to our villain for this week. You see, in an attempt to unite the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, Ahaziah, who was the king of Israel, gives his daughter to be the wife to Jehoram, the king of Judah. And Ahaziah's daughter and Jehoram's wife was Queen Athaliah, our villain for today. Queen Athaliah. And together Jehoram and Athaliah made Baal worship the official religion of Judah. It got to the point where Jehoram became paranoid that someone would try to take his power. And so Jehoram had his 6 brothers and other princes that might challenge him all put to death, so that there was no one else that was in line to the throne. You see, the pursuit of power leads to moral decay every single time. The pursuit of power leads to moral decay. And that's what we saw in the life of Jehoram and Athaliah. Well, Jehoram and Athaliah have children, and one of their sons was also named Ahaziah. And when Jehoram dies from a 2-year gruesomely painful stomachache, you have to read the story because it's partly gross but also partly hilarious. But after Jehoram dies, Ahaziah becomes king. This is how it's recorded in Scripture. Ahaziah also followed the evil example of King Ahab's family. So Ahaziah was evil just like his father, just like his grandfather. For his mother encouraged him in doing wrong. In other words, his mother throughout his childhood whispered to him about Baal worship, about not following God. And this was the result. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight. This is Ahaziah. Just as Ahab's family had done. They even became his advisors. His family, Ahab's family, became his advisors after the death of his father, and they led him to ruin. Ahaziah was only 22 years old when he took over the throne of Judah. but he only reigned for 1 year. And it's very interesting because one day he goes to visit his cousin, the king of Israel, and while he is on the road headed there, he happens to run into assassins who are on their way to kill the king of Israel because they wanted to completely erase the hereditary line of Ahab. And when they saw Ahaziah, and they knew that he was the son of Jezebel, who was the daughter of Ahab, they killed him too. It just randomly happened to run into them, and he was killed. And this takes us to where Queen Athaliah comes into place. This is what it says. It says, when Athaliah, the mother of King Ahaziah of Judah, learned that her son was dead, that he had been killed. Now, here's something to understand about Athaliah. Athaliah was ambitious. And when she saw that her son had died, she saw an opportunity to become queen. Not just queen because she's married to the king, but to be queen and to actually rule. Now listen, ambition can be a good thing. A lot of great people are ambitious. A lot of great advancements in the world happen today because of ambition. But when our ambition blinds us, that we can't tell the difference between right and wrong, it can lead to a lot of heartache and to a lot of pain, not just for us, but for the people around us. Athaliah was ambitious, but it was blind ambition. And she wanted to rule. She wanted to be queen. But you see, the way that succession works, she couldn't be queen as long as Ahaziah had heirs. Now, normally, when a king dies, and the king's children, who were at this time very, very young, when they're too young to rule, the queen is often appointed the queen regent, where she will essentially be the queen until the son comes of age. She's like the caretaker of the kingdom until the son becomes of age, and then the son takes over as king. Being queen regent is a very prestigious and a very powerful position. But that's not what Athaliah wanted. She wanted to be queen. So get this. When Athaliah, the mother of King Ahaziah of Judah, learned that her son was dead, she began to destroy the rest of Judah's royal family. In other words, she had all of Ahaziah's children put to death. Now, did you get that? She had all of Ahaziah's children put to death. Ahaziah was her son. She had all of her grandchildren put to death so that she would become queen, so that Ahaziah would have no heir. And her plan worked. Without any heirs, Athaliah became queen. She became queen. And Athaliah had watched and had experienced Baal worship her entire life. Her mother, Queen Jezebel, had whispered into her entire life. And so when Athaliah became queen, Baal worship completely took over Judah. She had Baal temples built inside the temple of the Lord. She appointed priests of Baal to become priests of all the temples and houses of worship all throughout the kingdom. Her reign marked a time of spiritual decline in the kingdom of Judah. And she did everything that she could to solidify her power and continue the legacy of Baal worship that she received from her parents. Now, what she didn't know was that as she went out to try to kill all of her grandchildren, one of her grandsons survived. This is the account that's written actually in a different book of the scriptures. Listen to what it says. But Ahaziah's sister, Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, took Ahaziah's infant son Joash and stole him away from the rest of the king's children who were about to be killed. She put Joash and his nurse in a bedroom, and they hid him from Athaliah so the child was not murdered. Joash remained hidden in the temple of the Lord for 6 years while Athaliah ruled over the land. See, Joash was not raised by Queen Athaliah. Joash was raised by Jehoiada, the high priest at the time before Athaliah completely took over. He was the last high priest of the temple. And when Joash is 7 years old, Jehoiada gathers together the remaining faithful military leaders, many of whom hated Athaliah, gathered them together, and they came up with a plan to make Joash king. Jehoiada told the military leaders this plan of how to set the guards so that it would be their guards that would be guarding the temple. And then Jehoiada and the others sneak Joash into the temple. And while he is in the temple, Jehoiada anoints him king of Judah. And so Joash is now anointed king of Judah. He's surrounded by soldiers to protect him. And when it is announced that he is the new king, the people who are there are rejoicing. They are so happy. And that's one of the things that we need to remember, that our faith, together with God's faithfulness, always overcome the plans of the wicked. That no matter how smart they are, no matter how wise they are, no matter how rich they are, that their wicked plans will always be overcome when our faith and God's faithfulness come together. And so Athaliah, she's in the palace. And she hears the commotion. She hears the trumpets that are coming from the temple. And so she runs to the temple. And she looks inside and she sees Joash, and he's wearing the crown. She sees him standing next to a pillar, which was the traditional place of authority. And she sees the soldiers and the trumpeters around him, and she hears the crowd of people cheering and yelling, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" And so she starts to shout, "Treason! Treason!" And at Jehoiada's orders, the soldiers, they take her out of the temple, because no one is supposed to be killed in the temple. They take her out through the gate that is usually only used for the horses. And outside of the gate, outside of the palace, she is killed. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Hey, great story. But, what does that have to do with me? Great story, but look, I don't have any kids yet, so what does this have to do with me? Hey, great story, but my kids, they're grown already. Like, my window for influencing them is gone. It's too late for me. It's a good story, a good lesson, but what does it have to do with me? And see, generations of kings and queens from the time of Solomon on through moved God's people away from worshiping him. They moved the culture away from worshiping him. They moved the people away from worshiping him. But because of the faithfulness of just a few people who continued to be faithful to and have faith in God and trusted God, the entire nation was restored. Now, the ones that were faithful were not in line for the throne. The ones that were faithful weren't in power. The ones that were faithful, we don't know anything about how they raised their children. Only thing we know is that when they had an opportunity to be faithful to God, they were. And because of their faithfulness, the lineage of the kings of Israel were restored. The line of David was restored. They completely changed the world simply because of their acts of faithfulness. And that's what you and I have to remember. Whether we haven't had any children, or we don't plan to have any children, or we are raising our children right now, or our children are already grown, wherever it is that we are, we have to remember, every single one of us, that every interaction that we have moves our generation today either closer to God or farther away from God. Every interaction that you have with every person, no matter how big or how small it is an interaction that moves our culture together either closer to God or farther away from God. Every conversation, every act of kindness, every opportunity for us to love, to serve, to give to each other. Every single time that we have an opportunity to love and serve and give to our family, to our friends, to our classmates, to our co-workers, to our employers, to our employees, to our spouses, to our children, to our family, every opportunity that we have is an opportunity for us by our actions to move our generation either closer to God or farther away from Him. And you and I may never know how the smallest of our actions might change the future and the eternity of our generation and the next. A few faithful people being faithful and acting faithful changed the future and the destiny of a nation. And our faithfulness today, in the big acts and even in the small ones, have the potential to change our generation and to influence the next.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.